6 a.m. She changes into a gorgeous dress. She puts on a sword. She jumps on a horse, and she heads for St. Petersburg. And on the way, she meets her hairdresser, who's galloping, who's French, a French hairdresser. And he does her hair on the way to the revolution.
What leadership lessons can we learn from history's most powerful people? I'm entrepreneur Mike Soutar, author of Next Gen CEO, and you may have also seen me as one of Lord Sugar's trusted advisors every year on BBC One's The Apprentice. In History Extra's new series, History's Greatest Leaders, I'm talking to leading historians about some of the past's most remarkable people. Individuals who used their skills to leave a lasting legacy. If you don't want to miss an episode, don't forget to like and subscribe. In today's episode, I'm joined by historian, writer and TV presenter Simon Sebag Montefiore, who is the author of a diverse array of books including Young Stalin and Catherine the Great and Potemkin, The Imperial Love Affair. And it's Catherine the Great that we're going to be focusing on today. Simon, thank you so much for being with us.
Lovely to be here. Thanks for having me.
Catherine the Great is one of history's most formidable and remarkable female rulers. There's an apparent contradiction, isn't there, right at the heart of Catherine's story? Because on one hand, she is a ruler who champions the high-minded, at the times, ideals of the European Enlightenment, reason, science, individual liberty. But at the same time, in moments, she is a brutal aristocrat who deepens divisions and crushes her opposition brutally. How do we make sense of this paradox?
She was a politician, and in that sense, she had ideals, but she was essentially pragmatic. She was never afraid of a U-turn, what we call a U-turn, and she was very instinctive. She followed, the art of what was the possible, and she said to the philosophes, who were the sort of leaders of the Enlightenment, she said to them, like, it's all very well for you, you write on paper with pens, but I deal in human people with humans. I write on human skin, she said, and she meant that it's all very well thinking of these ideas, but you actually have to sell them. You have to make them happen. And she really had a very, very sharp idea about the nature of autocracy. She said, you say I'm an autocrat, but actually, what I have to do is I think of an idea, I have to sell it to everybody, I have to persuade them all to do it, I have to show them a way to do it, and when everybody's agreed to it, then I order it, and I call myself an autocrat. So she understood the nature of management brilliantly.
Mm-hmm. Give us a sense of the world into which Catherine comes of age. So she's not Catherine when she is christened. She is born a different name and not in Russia, but in Germany.
Well, she's born as a princess in a small town, Anhalt-Zerbst in Germany. And she's brought up as the daughter of a minor prince. And she's got a very strong mother. And she probably was destined for a life of total obscurity, would probably marry some sort of boring Bavarian army officer. And her name's Sophie, and her name isn't Catherine. And she then at about 10, they start to think, like, hang on a sec, this girl could marry the heir to the Russian throne, who was in fact German as well, who was called Peter Holstein.
So who masterminds this plan then? Where does this come from, that this kind of minor, potentially obscure German royal princess, who either sees her potential or who sees the political value in a match?
Well, of course, as you correctly surmise, it's really cooked up by two very powerful people. One is Elizaveta, Empress Elizabeth of Russia, who has no children, and her heir is her nephew, who is an appalling brat called Peter, and is German-speaking, doesn't really know Russia. And the other person is Frederick the Great, who's the King of Prussia, which is part of Germany now. And he wants to get somebody on the throne who could be useful to him and pro-Prussian. She wants to get someone onto the throne who is kind of would keep the Prussians happy and keep Germany happy. And Russian rulers had often used Germany as a sort of dating agency for marriages for their princes and princesses. So they cooked it up. And so at 14, she sets off with her mother to Russia. And Russia is this huge empire at this time, ruled by the Romanov dynasty. Europe is really ruled by monarchies completely, and mainly absolute monarchies, who are absolute monarchs who are part of great dynasties. So the Habsburgs rule kind of Austria and Czechoslovakia and a huge part of that part of Eastern Europe. Poland is an independent kingdom, a huge independent kingdom. Germany is a mixture of lots of little kingdoms. One of the biggest is Prussia, but even Prussia isn't that big. France is ruled by a dynasty, the Bourbons, and so on. The Habsburgs, another part of the Habsburgs, had ruled Spain as well, and of course Spain had this huge empire around the whole world. So it's a world of absolute monarchies and empires.
And is Sophie, soon to become Catherine, has she been prepared in any way in her upbringing for being able to step up to something as grand as this?
Not really. This is an interesting feature, isn't it, of management, because nowadays we think everyone has to be prepared for everything. But actually, as you know well, there is no preparation for actually ruling or running anything completely yourself. And it was later said Nicholas II, the last Tsar, for example, was unprepared. Well, how do you prepare anyone for ruling the Russian Empire? So no, she was totally unprepared, and she didn't have any language. She didn't speak Russian. She just knew nothing about it. She just set off on this trip. She was told she was marrying this youth, and off they went.
And so this youth that she marries, this somewhat unreliable character, tell me a bit about Peter.
I wonder if now we would call him, we'd say he had mental health challenges. We might do. But I think the key thing about him was he lacked empathy.
Okay.
And he certainly lacked wisdom. And he certainly lacked judgment. But, they were very young. He
was 17 at this time.
They were in their teens. He'd been very spoilt. He was, part of this he was the heir to the Russian throne, for heaven's sake. So he goes to Russia too, and he hates Russia because he likes Germany. He thinks Germany is the most civilized place on the world, and he speaks German. He tries to learn Russian, and he regards the Russians as savages, animals, and he says so to them. And
that's a bit of a mistake.
But it's not as much of a mistake as you might think, because there are a lot of Germans in the Russian Empire.
Okay.
And the Russian Empire is actually kind of, to a large extent, run by German army officers.
So there's a kind of a chauvinism that sits at the top of the hierarchy there.
Yes, and a lot of the Romanovs have married Germans. So it wasn't like he was just on his own in Russia saying Germans were, he arrived also with an entourage. But he was immediately started drinking heavily. And he couldn't really hold his drink, and he was not love's young dream either. When they marry, he's immediately kind of humiliates her and treats her appallingly, and sort of
how
it's very hard to tell what happens in the sex life, which of course is important for young people, and but he neglects her. He doesn't show any interest in her at all. He doesn't really show any interest in her as a person in any shape or form. And he does kind of terrible things, like he accuses a rat of treason and then hangs the rat in their bedroom, and says, with a placard that says guilty of treason. So this is not the way. The dead rat has never been a way to a woman's heart.
That's not how you woo.
It's not romance, is it? But the point is, he's also extremely unwise in terms of building alliances and connections and that sort of thing. Because of course they are very young, but it's an age where people become rulers very young, and everything happens young, and everyone dies at 50. So in fact, it's not such an excuse. Maybe in the teens, but once they're in the sort of early 20s, there's not much excuse for his behavior, and he's very bad at sort of, understanding the politics. Now, politics at the Russian court it's a bear pit. It's brutal. I mean, at the top is Empress Elisaveta, who had been this incredibly beautiful woman and was Peter the Great's daughter, but she's now getting older, touchy, and she's an absolute tyrant, an autocrat. And underneath are all these factions struggling brutally to try and get as much wealth and power as possible. And if you lose, you're quite likely to be tortured, and you can even be executed or exiled. So it's a brutal competition.
And so for somebody like Peter to walk into that with the deficits or in his character or issues that he might have, presumably he proves himself really quite unpopular with the people that he's supposed to be ruling.
He's very unpopular very quickly, and people don't trust him, don't like him. While Catherine immediately shows, that indefinable quality, charm, and she's got charm and charisma. She's attractive. She's not a beauty, but she's got these wonderful blue eyes. She's playful. She's highly intelligent.
Okay,
and she says later, the moment I arrived, I found every old woman and found out the name of their little dog. And so, it's just basic kind of, again, for your expertise, this is like literally management 101, isn't it?
Yes, it's Alex Ferguson at Man United, goes and learns the name of absolutely every member of staff and makes an absolute point of knowing
their wives
knowing their business.
And their children and their dogs. So she learns that she laughs. She says, I learned the name of every parrot and pug in every grand house in Petersburg. So
she's got empathy. She's got that insight that means she knows how to engage with people. But what else does she do kind of tangibly in order to work her way into a place where she can ultimately take advantage?
Well, I mean, one thing she does, which is probably dangerous, is that she in the end she has an affair. She starts to have affairs and she's immediately under huge focus of all these kind of dashing young princes and counts and stuff who are the Russian court, and they all shamelessly flirt with her. And of course, there's a bit of politics in that because she's going to be an important character, though. It's also a very dangerous game because she's the wife of the future Tsar. But these affairs immediately lead her into politics, and she's drawn into politics as a young person who she's not really fully qualified. And that almost leads her to some very dangerous moments when she could have been executed. I mean, she could have been arrested. She could have been exiled. She could have been divorced and sent home.
Is this just because her husband, doesn't realise what's going on behind his back?
He takes his own mistress.
Yeah.
And so the marriage doesn't go well, but that's not necessarily a big problem in an 18th century aristocratic marriage, as you can imagine. But the thing is, she's got to provide the throne with an heir, and so the Empress Elisaveta encourages her to have a lover, her first lover, and probably to get a child, because of course, though the child would be technically illegitimate, no one would know that. But equally, Catherine encourages that story later because she hates her son. But the son is actually incredibly similar to the husband and even looks like him. So it's obvious that there was more of a sex life than she ever admitted. And probably the son, Paul, who later became Tsar, he probably is the son of the father he was meant to have. But anyway, so that's part of it. But part of it is, there's a huge competition at the Russian court between the French and the British and the Habsburgs and all these different interests. And Catherine gets involved in these intrigues, and it almost leads to disaster. And but the Empress is incensed by both the sort of young people, and she sort of forgives them both, and they get away with it. But she's now getting very old, and it's made much worse when in 1756 the 7 Years' War starts, in which Russia is fighting and England is fighting and Prussia is fighting, and so there are great conflicts. It's very dangerous time. So she gets through this, is the point. And as she gets through it, she emerges as the Russian candidate, the leader of the Russian party, while her husband, who is the heir to the throne, is really a kind of pro-Prussian party, which is very dangerous because they're at war with Prussia.
Okay.
So it's complicated. But the point is, she's very good at building alliances. She's built her own group. She has a group of followers who really believe in her.
Mm-hmm. So she starts to get a power base because she networks well, as you say. She builds alliances. What, military alliances?
Yeah, she builds. I mean, the key alliance in the Russian court is the guards, guards regiments, because the guards regiments are the Praetorian guards of the Russian Empire, and they're key to who's next going to be Tsar.
Because they can either protect you or they can turn on you, right?
Yeah, they can destroy you. So she takes her lover is Grigory Orlov, who's an officer, and he's one of 5 hunky brothers. I would describe them as, who are all guards officers. So these 5 guards officers are the kind of heroes of the guards.
Okay,
and they're all young. They're in their early 20s, and they're dashing. They're war heroes. They've all been constantly promoted. They're swaggering around. Pin-ups. And she takes one of these as her lover, and that's very useful. And again, typical Catherine, it's both kind of she's in love with him, but it's also sensible, pragmatic.
So there are many tensions, as you explained. There are geopolitical ones, and also there are tensions at court, and there are tensions within that marriage as well. That comes to a head in 1762, doesn't it? So Peter ascends to the throne. He's been Tsar for just 6 months when Catherine takes a massive gamble. What does she do? She
leads a coup d'etat and she overthrows her husband. And in effect, she has her husband murdered. So, this isn't to be recommended as management or even leadership lessons that you're teaching viewers of this. But that's what happens in effect. And she managed to get away. Mostly in history, she's sort of forgiven or managed, for murdering her husband. But in effect, that's what happened. She doesn't order it. She claims it was against her orders, but it had to happen.
But I mean, history though is littered, isn't there, with people saying, "Well, I wasn't responsible for that. It was a throwaway comment."
Yes, exactly. It was a bit like that. So what happens is she's actually about to be arrested herself, and her husband is about to, realizes that she's got lovers. She's cultivating a faction in the guards, her own followers, and also he just hates her and is a kind of fool. And in his 6-month reign, he only reigns as Tsar for 6 months. He manages to offend every single section of Russian society that mattered. In other words, he offends the army, and the guards especially. He offends the church, the aristocracy.
And how? By legislating against them?
By arresting people, by legislating against them, by insulting them personally. And the biggest thing he does is, they've just been fighting this war against King Frederick the Great of Prussia, and he changes sides. They're about to destroy Frederick the Great, and he cancels the war and becomes an ally of Frederick the Great. And of course, that's outrages everybody. So and then he's about to arrest Catherine. So it's kind of
because he gets wind of this coup.
He gets wind of her intrigues, and he's also wants to marry his own girlfriend. And so, for all sorts of reasons, personal and political, he says, we're going to have to arrest her, and he says to her several times, "I'm going to arrest you and lock you in a monastery forever." So she's sort of, she could be murdered at that. It's a threat to her life, in fact. So it's totally justified. And there are about 3 different coups whirling round, and she slightly kind of manages all of them. And in the end, she's woken at dawn by Grigory Orlov, and he says, that they're about to arrest us all. They start to arrest the conspirators. He says it's do or die at 6 a.m. She changes into a gorgeous dress. She puts on a sword. She jumps on a horse, and she heads for St. Petersburg. And on the way, she meets her hairdresser, who's galloping, who's French, a French hairdresser. and he does her hair on the way to the revolution.
On the horse, sitting behind her?
No, they stop and they do it. He actually gets into a carriage and they actually do her hair on the way, sort of as she goes, because she has to look good.
Yeah.
And then when she gets out, she then puts on a male uniform. She switches into a man's uniform, and apparently she looks very good in this uniform.
Yeah.
And she goes out and she just takes power, and she says to the guards, I'm Catherine II, back me. And they all do. And there's kind of, the regime just disintegrates. And she arrests her husband, and she declares herself Catherine II. And the husband, Peter, is taken away to a fortress, locked up, and there is murdered in supposedly what they tell her is a sort of drunken fight.
Okay. He slipped on a bar of soap.
He slips on a bar of soap. In fact, he's strangled. And but they announce, and this is very Russian. They announce that not a bar of soap. They announce that he's died of hemorrhoids, and
so not even a noble death.
Not even a noble death. They say he's died of hemorrhoids. And Diderot, who's one of the most famous philosophers, when he's invited to Russia, he says, "I wouldn't dare go to Russia because I've got hemorrhoids." So hemorrhoids is a very dangerous disease to have in Russia, a condition to have in Russia.
So she becomes secure on the throne. Is that fairly much overnight, or is that a process?
No, very slowly. I mean, first of all, she's in grave danger because you've got to realize that as we started discussing, she's not a Romanov. She's not a Russian, and she's no relation by blood to the throne, to the dynasty. So to some people, she's literally just standing in as a sort of regent until her son is old enough to rule. Mm-hmm. And for other people are loyal to her, and all sorts of people have plans of how they can use her, manipulate her, control her. But of course, it turns out that she's highly intelligent, a brilliant strategist, has got brilliant empathy, and is brilliant with people. And of course, all management is about people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So she secures herself there and then sets about dramatically modernizing Russia's legal and social framework according to the tenets of the cutting-edge philosophy of the day. So 1767, she convenes a massive legal commission, and she personally spends a lot of time drafting, it's called the nakaz?
Yeah, or the instruction is what she produces. And, it's to improve all sorts of things. It's to end serfdom, for example, because, the great majority of Russians are, in fact, peasants. And the great majority of the peasants are serfs, which is almost a form of slavery. Mm-hmm. And so it's also extremely inefficient as well as being inhumane. So Catherine is planning, as a good enlightened person, to abolish this.
So this is kind of enlightenment, but also pragmatism?
Yes.
She sees that there will be an economic benefit to freeing the serfs from their status?
The Enlightenment it's about being humane, but it's also about being efficient. So the Enlightenment, a large part of the Enlightenment is efficiency, and of kind of getting rid of old ways and old inefficiencies. This works very well. It's entirely consistent, but of course the nobility are all important, and the nobility own the serfs, and their wealth is measured in serfs. So when Catherine realizes that actually she's going to offend the nobility, and the nobility have put her in power, and the nobility can take her out of power, so then she retreats from the more dramatic of these reforms.
Okay, so she waters them down.
She waters them down radically.
Where does it go from? What did she say she was going to do, and then where do we end up with this?
She basically doesn't do any of them. She increases efficiency. She makes improvements in the military, for example, which is a large part of Enlightenment, by the way, because she is the classic enlightened despot. She's an autocrat who wants to improve things. She makes all sorts of improvements, but she doesn't do these dramatic reforms, and she completely retreats from them, and they never happen.
I mean, is that a failure of leadership, or is that just something more canny?
It's canny because she's in a very, very vulnerable situation. She's an upstart. She's a regicide. She's a usurper, So she's really there in a very, very unstable position. And, many other people would break under the pressure. But she also has what you might call in management a first-class temperament, which is part of it as well, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's not like she's not sleeping at night and she's going crazy. No, she can handle everything. She's brilliant at everything. She does what she needs to do always. Basically, in about 1772, she has this massive crisis, and she really is in danger of losing her throne. And this is sort of 10 years after 10 years in power. Her son is about of the age to take power, so he's a major threat to her, and he hates her because he thinks that she's murdered his father, and he is also exactly like the father, sort of massively lacking empathy. So she's determined not to give up power and to let him take control. But also she's in a war which they're losing. There's also a massive peasant revolt that she's crushing. So on all of these things, she's in an existential crisis, the biggest crisis of her career. And to save her, she turns to a best friend, a lover, a partner in ruling, and that's Prince Potemkin, that's why my book is Catherine the Great and Potemkin. And he is an extraordinary character who is as talented as her, as gifted as her, and they're also very attracted to each other.
How did they meet?
They met on the day that she seized power. He was the person that controlled her horse. When she was going up to review the troops, her horse was out of control, and he kind of calmed it and looked after her. And he's 10 years younger than her. So when she sees power, she's like 30, in her early 30s, and he's in his early 20s. So he's 10 years younger, but he's an extraordinary character. He's like 6'4", with amazing hair, auburn hair. He's got one eye, and he's a sort of Russian giant. But he's also an intellectual, a brilliant intellect, a brilliant statesman, and an imaginative visionary like her. And people that know them say they're like twin souls. She describes them as twin souls, but other people that know them say they're exactly alike. No wonder they're in love with each other. So she's been resisting him for a long time, and he's been in love with her. Whenever he bumps into her in the court, he falls to his knees and grabs her hand and says, "I'm in love with you." And she laughs, but of course she's thrilled because she's very bored of Orloff, who's now kind of taking her for granted, and is also quite stupid. Well, she's very attracted to Potemkin, who's kind of an intellectual genius and can speak many languages, and is so in the height of this crisis, she needs a partner and a friend, an advisor, if you like. So she takes him as a lover, and he immediately becomes her top advisor, her actual co-ruler. She makes him a prince, and he immediately handles all these problems for her and gives her the confidence to manage the war, manage the slave rebellion, and to deal with the son, and gives her confidence. Because as a woman on her own at court, it's a lonely place.
And so for all three of those conflicts, the war is resolved how, the peasants' revolt is crushed how, the son is managed how?
The peasants' revolt is a huge crisis because not only are these tens of thousands of peasants marching on Moscow, but the nobility is in kind of near rebellion about her failure to handle it, to crush it. So in that case, Potemkin helps her appoint the correct nobleman, but doesn't give him too much power. And the revolt is crushed. The war is, she appoints the right commander again, thanks to Potemkin organizing it, and then he negotiates the peace. Mm-hmm. And the third thing is the son. They just put off the son. And Potemkin is now a strong guy swaggering around at court. And so he gives her the strength to sort of say, no, we're not going to hand over power to this useless youth. And so they don't. And so the most glorious part of her reign is, ironically, a partnership with these two extraordinary people. And he basically ran the empire for her and conquered the whole of Ukraine and South Ukraine and Crimea.
I'm really interested in this reformist character as she came in with the Enlightenment that then matured or turned into somebody who was far more autocratic. The decisions to change from one to another, is it fair to see this the moment where she decides to abandon many of her reforms, where she shifts decisively from enlightenment to despot, or is that just too simplistic a reading of things?
I think that's accurate about the serfdom stuff and some of the legal reforms. Yeah, it's fair enough, but it's slightly to misunderstand the Enlightenment, because the Enlightenment a lot of it was about efficiency, and so there wasn't really a contradiction. It wasn't about democracy or accountability as we understand it at all. There was nothing contradictory about being an autocrat and being enlightened, first of all.
Okay.
And secondly, the Enlightenment was a large part of it was about making things more efficiency, so you could increase the power of your state. And the power of states were then measured in their size and their population and the size of their armies and victories and conquests. And so there was nothing contradictory about that. A Russian emperor, and she was a Russian empress, was really dedicated to a mission of expanding the Russian Empire, as were all the rulers of Europe at the time. And so that was very much part of it. They believed that was their duty as ruler. And so she and Potemkin then spent the rest of, they spent much of their reign expanding aggressively wherever possible.
How does her story end, and what happens afterwards? What is her legacy?
Her legacy is an enormous success. She's regarded as one of the great Russian rulers. And in fact, when Putin, for example, became president, he considered basing himself on Catherine. He didn't, because she was a woman. He then considered basing himself on Potemkin, but he was too decadent. So in the end, he often cited their success, though, because she'd expanded the country enormously. She conquered the whole of South Ukraine. She conquered Crimea. She founded Sebastopol, which again is still a well-known, important city. She founded the Black Sea Fleet. She annexed Poland. So she was an immense success. She annexed parts of the Caucasus, Georgia. So she expanded the Russian Empire. So she was a giant success. She also ruled stably. Russia has unstable tendencies. In a very long, from 1762 to 1796, she rules, and she becomes very loved by the people, by the nobility, very respected. After a while, no one challenges her. And you were right at the beginning when you said it is a mixture between great empathy and clever management of people. She's brilliant at the people she chooses. She's one of those leaders who is never afraid to promote talented people.
Mm-hmm. She knew how to delegate and find their superpowers.
That's right. So in the end, she dies of old age. Potemkin has already died. And when he dies, she says, I'll never be able to replace him. I'll never recover from it. She almost has a stroke when he dies. But she continues. She makes a fool of herself in her old age by taking wildly young and foolish lovers and over-promoting them. And she has got a weakness for falling in love with people. She's not promiscuous in the sense that that she's often presented in that way. She's not promiscuous. She's always in love. She says, I have to be in love at all times, she says. And so she falls in love with this horrible popinjay, an absolute jackanapes. So then she dies of a stroke, and she's succeeded by the son she always delayed making Tsar, and he's Emperor Paul. And rather like his father, he was disastrous immediately. He managed to rule for just about 4 years and was killed in a coup and murdered in a most brutal fashion as the most hated man in the Russian Empire. So that's the story of Catherine the Great.
Is she known as Catherine the Great while she's still alive, or is that someone else's myth-building endeavours?
No. She's known as Catherine the Great in her life, and Voltaire, the French philosopher, names her Catherine the Great, and of course she encourages that as much as possible. She's a brilliant self-promoter. We haven't talked about that, but that's part of her. That's another one of her management skills.
So she builds a kind of a personal or a professional brand identity.
She does exactly that. That's exactly what she does. She's a master self-promoter, a master at brand building and advertising, marketing herself and Russia. And And though everyone knows that she's an autocrat and she came to power, the unfortunate details that she overthrew her own husband, who was then mysteriously died of hemorrhoids, as you do in Russia, she becomes, universally respected.
So, an idealist thwarted by circumstances, or a power player who does whatever is needed to stay on top? Simon, I will leave the last thoughts to you on Catherine the Great as a leader.
I think both. And I think she would regard herself as an idealist who was always also a pragmatist.
And that's all we've got time for today. Simon Sebag Montefiore, thank you so much again for being with us. That was utterly fascinating. If you want to find out more about Catherine the Great and her extraordinary life and her complex legacy, the History Extra team has put together a wealth of articles, podcasts and videos. You'll find the link to those in the description to this episode. We'll be back soon for more of history's greatest leaders, but for more fascinating content on some of the past's most powerful people, visit the History Extra app now.